Here there is some good news in the outlook. We project annual headline inflation in the OECD as a whole will fall relatively quickly, from 9.4% in 2022 to 6.6% this year and 4.3% in 2024. In major advanced economies, annual inflation is projected to be close to, but mostly still above, targets by the end of 2024. Headline inflation in the euro area will fall quite quickly, with food and energy prices falling, but core inflation is projected to moderate only slowly, remaining well above 3% in 2024. There are risks to this outlook. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine remains a large source of uncertainty. The war is first and foremost a humanitarian tragedy. It is, however, also a high potential source of further disruptions to the world economy and continued threat to food and energy security. These charts show selected key wholesale food, fertiliser and energy prices, which spiked up when the war broke out. They have fortunately come back down since their peaks last year, but risks to prices from the war remain. We don't know how the war will evolve, but the potential global impact remains a key source of concern. A substantial risk is that inflation proves to be more persistent, and in response, interest rates need to be higher for longer. Over the past 18 months, underlying inflation has consistently proved to be more sticky than projected by the broad majority of national and international forecasters. This chart shows the share of items where prices have increased by more than 5% for at least 12 months. This share has gone from near zero at the beginning of 2021 to around a quarter in the US and over a third of the consumption basket in Germany. If inflation surprises by being more persistent, inflation expectations may rise to levels well above targets and possibly entrench inflation through greater indexation of contracts and financial assets. To tackle this, significant additional monetary policy tightening would be required, weighing on growth and increasing risks of financial market vulnerabilities. However, with energy prices having already declined substantially, inflation could potentially also surprise by falling faster than expected. Let me turn to another risk, the level of debt around the world. Total debt in many advanced and emerging market economies is high following a general upward trend and recent shocks. On the left panel, you can see that in advanced economies, total debt has increased and currently stands above 250% of GDP. The biggest driver is the increase in government debt, the blue bars, from below 70% of GDP in 2007 to above 110% towards the end of last year. The change in total debt in emerging market economies, shown in the right-hand side panel, is a bit different. Here, most of the increase in debt stems from non-financial corporations, the pink bars. Higher debt increases debt financing costs, and higher government debt ratios may limit policy space for the future. Moving to the final risk I want to highlight this morning. Geopolitical tensions have been on the rise for some time. This graph shows you the share of items under new import restrictions imposed by G20 economies. Restrictions have been rising steadily since the global financial crisis. COVID-19, and more recently Russia's war against Ukraine, further exposed and intensified tensions over trade and security of supply. A move away from the open, rules-based free trading system, which has benefited people around the world in past decades, would lower global growth and make people around the world worse off. So what should policymakers do about all this? First, let's start with monetary policy. We need to bring inflation back to targets. Monetary policy will need to remain restrictive until policymakers are confident that underlying inflationary pressures are durably reduced. This will mean different things for different countries. In the chart, we show the policy interest rates for advanced economies on the left and emerging market economies on the right. The shaded areas show projections. As you can see, policy interest rates in many countries are projected to have reached their peaks or are expected to do so in the next few months. In economies where core inflation continues to prove persistent, additional interest rate increases or keeping interest rates higher for longer may be required. As monetary policy works its way through economies, in 2024, inflation in many countries is projected to ease towards central bank target ranges, potentially providing some scope for policy rate cuts. Moving on to fiscal policy, in 2022, governments rolled out substantive fiscal support to cushion the effects of high energy prices. This support was necessary and prevented a bigger fallout from the economic shock of the war. However, today we're in a different place. In many countries, food and energy prices have fallen or are declining, and minimum wages and welfare benefits have been permanently increased. Fiscal policy now needs to tighten in many countries and better align with monetary policy. Broad-based emergency support, the orange bars, should be withdrawn. However, some households will continue to struggle with cost of living and the cost of living crisis. They will need further support. Policymakers should target that support to the most vulnerable households where they are inadequately covered by the general social protection system. This is a key message, warranting repetition. The orange bars represent broad, non-targeted support. That needs to be disappearing. Moving forward, governments need to adapt their fiscal policies to prepare for the future. As you can see on the left-hand chart here, government debt ratios have increased in response to COVID and the war. They are expected to stay persistently higher than their levels before these shocks. Yes, debt levels fell in 2021 and 2022, to a large extent due to surprise inflation, an effect that cannot lower debt sustainably. Elevated debt reduces resilience and limits future fiscal space at a time when many countries are already facing rising spending pressures. Ageing, as shown in the right-hand side panel, means a rapidly increasing share of individuals older than 65 compared to the working age population. Improved life expectancy and medical advances are great developments, but ageing will also increase pressures on budgets through higher related spending and lower revenues. Governments need to take policy action now to prepare for and respond to these changing longer-term fiscal pressures, including ensuring pension liabilities are sustainable and extending working lives. The projections I took you through earlier show economies that are recovering but to weak levels of growth. The challenge is to sustainably lift longer-term growth rates. This chart breaks down growth over the last 50 years in OECD economies. In the last decade, potential growth has halved compared to what we saw a few decades ago. You can see that the main drivers of the decline are ageing, which has reduced the size of the workforce, shown in the red portion of the graph, and even more striking is the fall in productive investment, shown in the green part of the graph. We need to return to higher levels of productive investment to counter the changes in the working age population by bringing more people into the workforce and working more productively. It's not just about ageing. If we turn to employment, a more inclusive labour market would counterbalance labour shortages and enable more people to benefit from economic growth. We can do more to make the most of the available pool of talent. This requires extending employment opportunities to more women, older people, and more people with health conditions and disabilities. Many countries can do much better on this. The chart on the left-hand side shows that women's employment rates still lag behind the rates of male workers. And on the right-hand side, we can see how in many countries it is still the case that women are paid less than men. Policy can change this, promoting affordable and high-quality childcare, flexible working arrangements, improving work incentives, and eliminating barriers to women's entrepreneurship can all improve employment outcomes for women and the economy for everyone. Moving on to investment, the need for greater productive investment, both public and private, in most economies is clear. Falling longer-term growth has been associated with falling levels of productive capital per worker. We need to turn this trend around. Reviving investment will also be important to deliver the green transition, as you can see in this chart. The International Energy Agency showed that clean energy investment needs to triple by the end of the decade for us to be on track to meet the net zero emissions target by 2050. More investment in innovation will also be needed to bring new climate-friendly technologies to the market and reduce their costs to ensure uptake. So to summarise, we see a recovery on the horizon, but there is still much more work to unwind the shocks of past years. If there are 3 policy messages you should take from this outlook, they are: 1, we expect inflation to recede, but the job is not yet done and monetary policy will need to remain restrictive until it is clear that inflation is durably reduced. 2, as prices ease, fiscal support should be scaled back and targeted only on those who need it. And 3, we are returning to a level of long-run growth that is less than it could or should be. We need bold, forward-thinking reforms and international cooperation to raise long-term growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Secretary General. We'll now open up the floor to questions from the media. Please identify yourself. Also, those watching online in the Zoom, please feel free to put your questions through in the chat. First one right here.
Good morning, William Horobin from Bloomberg. You recommend that central banks should remain restrictive and fiscal policy should be prudent. Can you say when the impact of this policy mix would be the greatest? And secondly, given the lag in the impact and the feeding through of tighter monetary policy, should major central banks be cautious in their upcoming meetings or just continue raising rates until they see the real data showing fall in underlying inflation?
Sure. We're seeing the impact of monetary policy tightening now, as you saw on both the refinancing costs and on factors like housing markets. So we're already beginning to see the impact of monetary policy tightening, and that will continue over the rest of 2023 and into 2024, and that will bring inflation down. As we're saying, it needs to remain restrictive until we see evidence that inflation is durably being returned to target. Of course, central banks need to remain vigilant and weigh both sides of the risk. Obviously, they shouldn't tighten too much, and to the point that would have a greater impact on growth than is necessary. So this is a delicate balance for central banks, but we are today saying they will need to maintain restrictive monetary policy until there is evidence that inflation is durably returning to target, and that means core inflation as well as headline inflation.
Lee Thomas from Reuters. In the same vein as the previous question, given that the full impact of the rate increases is going to be soon felt, is there a risk that central banks have already gone too far? What can you say about that? Thank you.
So we see the balance of risks as being a greater risk from potential further inflation persistence. As we've seen to date through this inflation crisis, inflation has surprised on the upside and continued to. Of course, as I said in the presentation, there are risks on both sides, and it may be as we reach a turning point on inflation, it falls faster than expected. But we do believe that central banks need to maintain the path that they are on of restrictive monetary policy until they see evidence that durably inflation is returning back to target, and that means core inflation, wages, all consistent with the long-term targets.
And I think it's also true to say that central banks are very mindful of the fact that as you go through the monetary policy tightening cycle, that eventually risks are becoming more evenly balanced. I mean, the risk of not doing enough versus the risk of doing too much. And that is, of course, something that central banks continue to very carefully monitor. But right now, the mission is to get inflation back to target, in a durable fashion. And right now, our assessment is that restrictive monetary policy remains important to get us to where we need to be.
Thank you. Another question right here.
Angel Calvo de l'agence espagnole de presse EFE. Sur la question des salaires, vous avez montré que presque dans la totalité des pays, il y a eu une perte de pouvoir d'achat parce que les salaires n'ont pas monté tant que l'inflation. Alors, qu'est-ce que vous recommandez à ce sujet? Est-ce qu'il y a un problème s'il y a une hausse très importante de salaire parce que ça va entraîner un maintien de l'inflation à un niveau élevé, ou au contraire, est-ce qu'il y a un problème parce qu'il y a une perte de pouvoir d'achat pour les travailleurs? Et puis une question sur l'Espagne. Vous avez relevé les prévisions pour l'Espagne. Le mois prochain, il y a des élections. On a vu dans le passé que pas nécessairement il y a une majorité très claire pour la formation d'un gouvernement. Est-ce que cela est un risque que vous tenez en compte ou pas du tout? Et puis une question aussi sur l'Espagne. C'est l'un des seuls pays pour lesquels vous ne prévoyez pas une baisse de l'inflation l'an prochain. Pourquoi?
Sure. So let me start with Spain. Spain had performed better than the average of the euro area in response to the war, and we have growth in Spain projecting to slow. to 2.1% this year, and then 1.9% in 2024. We do anticipate that lower inflation and the resilient labour market will support household consumption, as you say, through that. I mean, the economy has experienced quite sizable government support to this point, and of course a full recovery in tourism post the pandemic. So the economy's been very strong in relative terms through this period. I mean, what we are recommending for Spain is that going forward, the fiscal stance does need to be tightened to address high debt. That is, the expectation. As inflation recedes, fiscal support measures, as we're saying for other countries, need to be sort of reduced and targeted better. Of course, one issue for Spain, important issue, is productivity, and the recovery plan should be used to maintain and to increase productivity for Spain, and that's the thing we would recommend there. And of course, Spain needs to continue with its transition its green transition away from fossil fuels. Yeah. On wages, what we have in our projection is, so obviously real wages have been really squeezed during the inflation crisis. What we have in our projections is that will begin to recover now as inflation recedes, and real wages will recover some of the gains that they've lost. I mean, in practice, what that means is for a lot of people, at the moment, it may feel like this is, in a sense, the most painful part, because people are still experiencing very high inflation and real wages haven't kept up with that. But going forward, we expect some recovery in real wages, so this will begin to feel better as inflation eases and people begin to see a rebuilding in their real wages.
Another question here in the room, please, right there.
Hello, yes, Ali Bektawi for AFP. I had a more broader question on investment, development and debt. I wanted to know if the OECD plans to be part of the summit that is taking place later this month in Paris at the initiative of President Macron for a new financial summit. Do you intend to be here, and what are the priorities of the financial reforms you think are the most important to develop the financial aid to vulnerable countries and the energy transition? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, the answer to your first question is yes. We will, of course, be there and support the summit that's been organized by President Macron. And I mean, this is a very important piece of responding effectively to the climate challenge and also to the sustainable development challenge, generating the necessary level of public and private financial investment. And I'm very much looking forward to finding solutions to generate the very substantial levels of investment that will need to be generated in order for us to be able to successfully transition to a net zero economy globally, in a way that is globally effective but also fair and equitable, and also to re-energize the momentum towards achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, quite some progress was being made, but the pandemic and the impact of the war of aggression in Ukraine, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, have presented very significant setbacks. And this is a great opportunity for the world to refocus on the task at hand and to come up with the innovative solutions to really leverage and to make sure that we have a globally more coherent approach to generate the necessary level of public and private investment, all heading in the same direction.
Other questions? One right here.
Good morning, Richard Yo from Les Echos. In your presentation, you mentioned the low level of growth of potential output, and you ask for investment. In that context, what do you think of the American policy with IRA, the EU policy with Net Generation or Green Deal? Do you think that the solution or part of the solution are public subsidies to improve investment? Thank you. Thanks.
So, I mean, the US is one of the three top greenhouse gas emitters in the world. We welcome very much that the US is ramping up efforts to tackle the climate challenge and investing in technology. A successful transition to a greener economy is going to require considerable public investment. So steps that mobilise investment are welcome, the US, EU and in other countries as well. I mean, furthermore, the size of these markets means that it will help speed up progress in climate technology with potential positive spillovers for worldwide, as it will lower the cost of technology and encourage take-up. I mean, the challenge for all countries is to navigate the complex kind of political and economic pressures to act urgently on this, but also implement economically sound solutions. I mean, there is always a risk that subsidies end up poorly targeted and non-transparent, and marking distorting subsidies should be avoided. But, you know, climate ultimately is a global challenge. It's going to need a global solution, and that's going to need international cooperation, including avoiding distortions in the national and international playing field.
Thank you. Do we have more questions here in the room? Don't see any at this moment. We do have one here that's come in through the Zoom people who are watching online. This one is from Joel Hills from ITV News in the United Kingdom. Is inflation in the United Kingdom looking more persistent than in other developed economies?
Yeah, inflation in the UK is higher and is proving to be higher than in other countries at the moment. It's notably high for a combination of factors. So unit labour costs are high in the UK. You know, the labour market is particularly tight and wages are rising. The UK was also very exposed through its energy mix to the energy price, and that will feed through into other goods as well, and that's happening with a lag. So the UK has experienced particularly high inflation, slightly higher than other countries. In our projections, it is expected to see faster falling inflation and inflation to return in 2024 towards target.
Just a final check if there are any other questions here in the room.
Very good. Thank you.
If not, then we will close this press conference. You'll find all the information online, oecd.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.